for this story and where we stand in the trade dispute with China, we bring in a former official in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, Steve Gill. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Hey, Scotty.
I also want to look at later on how the U.S. is now involved in possible trade talks with the EU. But before that, we got to talk about Carter. And he's back, even though we thought that possibly he was just going on the circuit. He's actually giving, I guess, advice to current President Trump, who called him. But in regards to China, so do you think this was a good idea for President Trump to reach out and ask for his advice?
Well, I think this was precipitated by Jimmy Carter apparently writing a letter to President Trump offering his advice, and I think the president responded and called him to say, so what are you saying? Why do you think they're moving ahead of us? Now, there may be some accuracy that in some ways China is moving ahead of us. It depends on how you define it. When you look at their military spending, we don't really know exactly what they're spending, but we knew there's a huge wage gap between what they pay their soldiers and what we pay ours. And if you kind of put those on an equal footing, it may be that on military hardware, on weapons and other things, they may be outspending us. So there may be a legitimate concern there. In terms of economic growth, their GDP growth, their gross domestic product growth, is about double where ours has been. Now it's starting to slow down, and I think we have to look at the reality that there are large parts of China that are still effectively third world portions of their country, so they've got a big burden to bear as well. But certainly they are a strong competitor militarily, economically, and they have designs to be more powerful in the world. And I think President Carter warning the president of that, and President Trump being respectful and talking to a former president and saying, hey, what's on your mind is not a bad thing.
Absolutely not. Well, one thing that's also kind of progressive of this conversation is the EU. And now it's being told that the United States and President Trump is going to start into tariff talks with the EU. I have to question the timing with this. As you know, Brexit is happening, and you're seeing sort of this going back and forth. So now the EU is going to start these two types of negotiations. One is going to cut tariffs on industrial goods. The other is supposed to make it easier for companies to show products and meet EU or US standards. Is this actually good, though, for America to start holding the EU to these standards?
Well, I think it's good that we're engaging in some negotiations to kind of bring the trade relations with Europe up to where it ought to be. They have tremendous access to our market. We have limited access to theirs. And it's not just the tariffs or the taxes that are charged as goods and services flow back and forth. It's also what restrictions they put. You mentioned some of the testing standards of, are they keeping our goods and products out of their country by putting in specific requirements that their goods can meet and ours can't. So I think we want to see a level playing field, fair trade, as is sometimes said, rather than free trade. And I think that this kind of negotiation is important. We want access to more of their agriculture market. We want to be able to sell more of our agriculture goods there. We want more access to the service economy there. But frankly, the European Union has bigger problems than negotiating a new trade deal with the U.S. as the EU seems almost on the brink of falling apart as Brexit is seeing the United Kingdom split their political parties as they're trying to exit from Brexit. That could have a huge negative impact on the European economy. And while they're figuring out whether our fruits and vegetables and cattle products get into their country, they need to be more worried about the economic impact of Britain leaving and what that will mean to the European economy.
Well, Steve, you've watched President Trump and this administration. You have to question the timing of this and maybe President Trump taking advantage of the added pressure right now on the EU. But a part of that is France. France continues to be kind of like the one that's standing up and saying, we're not going to do this. And they're saying that they do not negotiate any trade deal with any country not a part of the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate. Do you think the rest of the EU feels this way, or do they actually need to start working some of these deals out?
I think the European Union desperately needs to be able to have trade relations with the U.S., and I don't think France, when they've had yellow-vested protesters in their streets for dozens of weeks now, when they are looking at the impact of the United Kingdom exiting Brexit and what impact that's going to have not only on their economy but the whole European economy, I don't think they're really in a strong position to be dictating to the U.S. or, frankly, anybody else trade policies based upon what they want. Their demands are not going to dictate what happens in the trade negotiations.
Well, Steve, last question I have to ask you. Do you think there's any reason, is there just a coincidence that we're dealing with the end of the China trade negotiations? You've got Brexit going on between the EU and Britain, and now we have the United States stepping up talks with the EU. Do you think this is all just a coincidence, or it all is dominoes falling into place?
I think to some extent it's dominoes falling into place because President Trump is somebody that when he finishes something, he turns the page. It looks like we may have a trade deal about to be announced. They're working on the minute details at this point, which means they've moved the big boulders to where they want them to be. They're now dealing with pebbles. As they finish that deal, President Trump's going to look up and say, okay, what's next? And Europe may be next.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, but I have to think, can you just finish one project and get some signatures on the dotted line before we move on to the next? I mean, multitasking is a good thing. Maybe not always, though. Thanks for joining us,
We got
Steve.
a president who has ADD. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, well, I would like to see some TRADE actually signed. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.